Welcome to Witch Elm, where the roses are trained, the teas are punctual, and memory sits at every window. Before we start today's mystery, tell me where are you listening from and how you find Miss Marple. Today's mystery is The Town That Lost Its Witnesses, a Miss Marple Mystery. Section 1. The Open Window. At 10:30 on a June morning, the windows of Witch Elm were open to the sun. Then a scream rose from the yew walk at Enderbe house and struck the village calm like a stone thrown into still water. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting beneath Florence Dane's striped awning, lifted her head at once. Florence dropped her teaspoon into the saucer. "That was Agnes," she said. "Something has happened at Mr. Enderbe's." "Yes," said Miss Marple, already getting up. "And if we go quickly, dear Florence, we may catch the facts before the village improves them." They crossed the lane through warm dust and pink campion. Witch Elm was not, in truth, a town at all, though certain residents called it one whenever history or self-importance required enlargement. It was a village with a square, a church, 2 substantial houses, a number of cottages which leaned toward one another as if exchanging confidences, and a memory far longer than its boundaries. At Enderbe house the gate stood open. Agnes, the maid, was crying with both hands over her mouth. On the grass beyond the yew arch, Mr. Lucius Enderbe lay on his side by the summer-house steps, one arm under him, his Panama hat flung away. There was blood at the temple, not much, but enough. Inside the summer-house, on the little iron table, stood 2 coffee cups placed opposite each other with the precision of a formal interview. One had been drunk, the other had scarcely been touched. Miss Marple did not go close. She never liked the indecency of crowding death. Yet she looked with perfect attention. Lucius Enderbe had retired to Witch Elm 12 years before from a reputable solicitor's practice and had gradually gathered into himself the parish accounts, local records, church subscriptions, old quarrels, and any anecdote that could be made to increase his importance. He was broad, pink, methodical, and self-satisfied. The sort of man who called gossip documentation and enjoyed it more when it hurt. For a week, people said, he had been hinting that he had put his hands on something from the past which would astonish the village at the forthcoming restoration fete. Agnes gasped. "He told me not to disturb him at 10:30, miss. Said it was a private matter. And he laughed when he said it." "Who was with him?" asked Florence. "I don't know. I brought the tray out and went back to fetch the sugar tongs. When I came again, he was there, like that." By then faces were collecting at the gate. Mrs. Pike from the post office, the curate's wife, old Mr. Bolter, a stable boy, Dr. Stephen Collier striding across from the square, and behind them the village itself, arriving by eyes before feet. Then Adrien Gresham came at a run from the Hall Lane and stopped dead at the sight on the grass. That pause created a theory at once. Adrien was handsome in the tired, uncertain way of men who have had promise and know they have not used it as the world expected. He had gone to London, failed at something artistic and expensive, and come back to live in the lodge wing of Gresham Hall. Everybody knew he had quarrelled with Enderbe in the lane the day before over family papers. Everybody also knew, or believed they knew, that his finances were precarious. Villages are seldom slow in arranging motive for the attractive. "Good God," Adrien said. Then, seeing the watching faces, he altered. "Has the doctor seen him?" Dr. Collier knelt, made the necessary examination, and rose. He was a thin man with careful hands and a face in which intelligence had long ago made terms with fatigue. "Dead, certainly. Not long. Agnes, send for the police. No one is to touch anything." "There," murmured Miss Marple to Florence, "that is the moment when everyone begins touching matters with their eyes. It does a surprising amount of harm." What fixed itself in her mind was not the wound, but the second cup. Enderbe had expected company and had arranged the meeting for his own pleasure. There is a particular neatness to blackmailing interviews which differs from hospitality only in soul. Inspector Craddock arrived from Market Basing within the hour, solid, courteous, and entirely unhurried. He had met Miss Marple before and retained the expression men wear toward old ladies who have once been right at their expense. He heard Agnes, Dr. Collier and Adrien walked the yew path and entered the summer house with the composed attention of a man unwilling to commit himself too early to either accident or melodrama. Near the step lay the heavy top of an old stone sundial. On the bench were local history files, a silver cigarette box, a fountain pen, and an envelope addressed in Enderbe's hand to the Chairman, Restoration Fete Committee. Craddock opened it. Inside was only a typed draft programme for the fete, and, in pencil beside the opening speech, the line, "At last we shall restore more than the church porch. A village should not go on closing its eyes." "Motive enough to begin with," said Craddock, and not a hint as to whom he meant. "Mr. Enderbe liked hints better than facts," said Miss Marple. "Facts end entertainment too soon." Craddock glanced at her. "Do you know what private matter he meant to discuss?" Florence answered first. "He told me yesterday at the flower meeting that Wych Elm should have a surprise at the fete opening. He was quite odious about it." The curate's wife, hovering nearby, added, "He said in the post office that by next week some persons might wish they had behaved differently in 1948. The year itself produced a silence. Miss Marple saw Sylvia Dean in the doorway then, pale and composed in grey. Sylvia was Celia Gresham's companion, quiet, competent, and somehow always as if braced against a draught no one else could feel. At the mention of 1948, the colour left her face so quickly that Miss Marple noticed it at once. Adrien said sharply, "Enderbe had been going through papers at the hall. He hinted he had found something affecting family history. When I asked to see it, he refused." Craddock turned. "You quarrelled with him yesterday?" "Yes, because he liked being dramatic with other people's lives." "And this morning?" "I was nowhere near here until I heard the commotion." The answer came too fast. Craddock merely wrote it down. Sylvia stepped forward then, with a message from Mrs. Celia Gresham, who was indisposed by the shock, and requested to be informed of any developments. The phrase sounded like something dictated to preserve rank from reality. Yet when Craddock mentioned papers, Sylvia asked at once whether anything had been taken from Enderbe's study. He looked up sharply. Why should anything have been taken? For a second she was lost. Then she said, "Only that if he had documents of value." "Documents are often more valuable than silver," said Miss Marple mildly, "especially if they concern old mistakes." Sylvia met her eyes with a queer expression, part fear and part appeal. By luncheon, the whole village had divided itself neatly into those who thought Adrien Gresham guilty because handsome men with uncertain incomes are felt to be asking for it, those who thought Enderbe had finally provoked the wrong victim, and those who preferred a stranger because strangers improve the flavour of misfortune. Open windows all over Wych Elm framed elbows, china ornaments, and listening faces. Miss Marple ate cold chicken in Florence Dane's dining room, while Noon moved white across the lane. "Do you think Adrien killed him?" Florence asked. "I think men who lose their tempers publicly are suspected far more often than they are guilty," said Miss Marple. "Besides, he looked angry this morning, but not relieved. There is a difference." "Then what did Enderbe mean by 1948? Miss Marple laid down her fork. "Clara Vale, I think." Florence stared. "My dear Jane, I'd forgotten." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "You had merely put it where people put unpleasant things. Clara Vale came to the hall in 1947 as companion to old Lady Gresham. Before a year was out, she was said to have gone away under a cloud. There were stories of theft and stories of a man, which is always a convenient addition when one wishes to finish a woman. Villages forgive almost anything except the need to alter an opinion once comfortably formed. You cannot think that is connected. Mr. Enderbe thought so, or wished others to think he thought so, and someone met him in his summer house at 10:30. She looked out through the open window where Mrs. Pike was pretending to rearrange parcels while watching the house. "There," she said, "the village is reacting. We shall have theories by tea and certainty by supper. Neither will be the least use. Villages have a charming way of watching everything. Their real failing is that when it matters very much, they look away." In the hall, at that very hour, Celia Gresham was hearing the news from Sylvia with a composure too controlled to be natural. "Dead?" she said. "How extremely inconvenient." Then, because Sylvia stared, she amended with chilly precision. "For the parish, naturally. Did he say anything to the inspector about old matters?" "Only what people heard, about 1948. A singular expression crossed Celia's face. Not grief, nor even fear, but anger that the past should behave without permission. "People hear what entertains them," she said. "You will say nothing of old nonsense if you are questioned." Clara Vale was foolish. The matter ended long ago. Sylvia bowed her head. Yes, Mrs. Gresham. But when she left the room, she paused a moment in the corridor, one hand against the wall, as though old nonsense had just put a living hand on her shoulder. Miss Marple, later, sitting again with her untouched knitting, thought of the second coffee cup, Sylvia's face, and that pencilled remark about closing eyes. If Enderbe had indeed found something from 1948, money alone would not explain the violence. Money is common enough. What is much harder to forgive is the danger of being seen clearly after one has spent years arranging the light. Section 2. Curtains in the Square. If Enderbe had found something from 1948, money alone would not explain the violence, and Florence Dane, who had never been able to leave an alarming thought undisturbed, said almost at once, "You don't suppose there was any truth in what people said of Clara, do you?" And thus carried them straight onward from murder to memory. Miss Marple resumed her seat beneath the awning. Across the square, windows opened and shut with a nervous precision that suggested not ventilation, but appetite. "Truth, my dear Florence," she said, "is very like old linen. It is often locked away because someone is ashamed of it, and when it is finally brought out, people complain of the colour rather than the concealment. Clara was young, pretty, and dependent. That combination is dangerous wherever respectability is treated as a possession." By 3 o'clock, Wych Elm was in full ferment. Mrs. Pike told customers at the post office that Adrien Gresham had nearly struck Enderbe in the lane. Mrs. Harbottle declared retired solicitors always kept blackmailing papers. The curate's wife felt it all extremely sad for Mrs. Gresham. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Bolter announced that the murderer must be left-handed because he himself, while trimming gooseberries, had considered the angle. The village had not evidence, it had flavour, and was making the most of it. Inspector Craddock took statements in the church room. Miss Marple did not interfere. She merely arrived with Florence carrying a bowl of roses for the flower committee, which made her presence inevitable and harmless. Adrien emerged first, lighting a cigarette with fingers made steady by effort. "I suppose the village has hanged me already," he said. "Not entirely," said Miss Marple. "Some of them are saving a little rope in case there should be a stranger." To her surprise, he laughed. Then the laugh vanished. "I did quarrel with Enderbe yesterday. He had come from the hall with one of those expressions he wore when he had discovered something unpleasant in someone else's affairs. He said there were documents among my grandmother's effects that required delicacy. I told him family papers belonged to the family. He said history belonged to the village." "And this morning?" He hesitated. "I walked toward Enderbe House, meaning to force the matter. Before I reached the gate, I heard Agnes scream. That's the truth, though it sounds like the sort of thing a liar would improve. Truth rarely sounds handsome," said Miss Marple. Craddock came out next with a notebook and the air of a man already burdened by too much conjecture. "Our victim left a note yesterday asking the parish clerk to fetch from the hall archives a tin dispatch box marked CV, he said. The clerk forgot and went fishing instead. Conveniently for him, the box is now missing. Mrs. Gresham says old papers have been sorted since Lady Gresham's death. The housekeeper says certainly not. Adrien says he has never seen the box." "CV," murmured Florence. "Clara Vale." "Possibly," Craddock said, "or county valuation, but the village prefers romance." "Quite right," said Miss Marple. "Romance is so often what causes the untidiness." Before he could reply, Sylvia Dean entered to give her statement. She emerged a quarter of an hour later looking paler than before, and Miss Marple spoke to her in the porch while the church clock ticked loudly above them. "Mr. Enderbe's remarks this morning distressed you, my dear." Sylvia stood very still. "I dislike scenes." "Did you know Clara Vale?" "No, only by name." The correction came too quickly. Miss Marple said, "Names are often more formidable than people. Did Enderbe say anything to you recently?" Sylvia's hand moved to her throat. "Do you think he really found something?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "either a fact or the chance to dress one up. The question is, which frightens someone more?" "Mrs. Gresham has been very kind to me," Sylvia said. It was not an answer, but it told Miss Marple a good deal. Later that afternoon, Edith Vale, Enderbe's housekeeper, came to Florence Dane's back parlour with outraged dignity and a folded apron. "I've been with him 11 years, she said, "and if people begin saying coarse things about his household, I won't have it. He had faults, but he wasn't mixed up in vulgarity." "No one said vulgarity, Edith," Florence protested. "They will. Agnes has already decided there was a woman because the second cup had lipstick. It wasn't lipstick, it was red currant jam from the biscuits. I know because I washed the plate." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "How helpful! And did Mr. Enderbe often take jam biscuits in the morning?" When he expected to enjoy himself, the words escaped before Edith could stop them. "Begging your pardon." "Not at all. Did he ever speak to you of Clara Vale?" Edith's face altered. "She was my cousin. Second cousin, but near enough. I was in service elsewhere then. Folks said what they liked after she went. They always do when a girl hasn't a mother." Florence exclaimed that she had never known. Edith ignored the interruption. "Mr. Enderbe asked me twice this week whether I remembered the old schoolhouse windows being painted shut in '48. I said I kept no account of schoolhouse windows." He laughed. "Painted shut?" repeated Miss Marple. "The east ones, facing the meadow. Everybody said they'd seen Clara's face there the last night she was about." Mr. Enderbe seemed to think that funny. When Edith had gone, Florence whispered, "If the windows were painted shut, then either memory has been lying for 28 years, said Miss Marple, or someone was very clever in giving the village a picture it preferred to truth." Tea at the hall that day was not cancelled. Celia Gresham believed in form and would as soon have appeared at breakfast without a collar as let a murder disarrange her social arrangements. She received the curate's wife, Miss Weatherby, Mrs. Pike, and Sylvia with old silver, thin bread and butter, and a composure so polished it reflected nothing honestly. At length Mrs. Pike could bear tact no longer. Such a shocking occurrence, and Mr. Enderbe digging into old things too. "There is talk of Clara Vale again, Mrs. Gresham." Sylvia set down her cup too sharply. Celia's eyes moved to her and away. "I should be bored, not distressed," Celia said. "That business was squalid and absurd. Clara left because she preferred excitement to duty." "But Mr. Enderbe said there were papers," began Miss Weatherby. "Mr. Enderbe said whatever increased attention to himself. The dead acquire virtues very quickly in villages. It is one of their few advantages." When the visitors had gone, Sylvia remained by the tea tray, gathering cups with hands that had become curiously cold. "Was Clara Vale really wicked?" she asked. Celia answered after a moment. "Weak, vain, melodramatic. She placed herself where she could be pitied and then resented the consequences." "People are seldom pitied," Sylvia said. "Only discussed. Take care, Sylvia. Gratitude and criticism do not sit well together." That night, in Florence Dane's spare room, Miss Marple lay awake longer than usual. It was not merely Enderby's death that troubled her, but the quality of the village reaction. Wych Elm had not met murder with clean astonishment. It had met it like a household hearing that a locked cupboard had finally burst open. There was expectancy inside the fear. The past was not merely remembered, it was waiting, and somewhere behind the talk of Clara Vale, painted windows, and missing papers, Sylvia Dean had asked not whether scandal would come, but whether anything had really been found. Section 3. Tea among theories. And somewhere behind the talk of Clara Vale, painted windows and missing papers, Sylvia Dean had asked not whether scandal would come, but whether anything had really been found. So when Florence entered Miss Marple's room next morning with the news that Inspector Craddock was downstairs and Adrien Gresham had been asked to remain available, the development felt less like surprise than pressure taking its next shape. Miss Marple went down at once. Craddock, standing in Florence's morning room between the aspidistra and the canary's cage, looked tired and mildly exasperated. "I have not arrested Gresham," he said, "but a labourer saw him near Enderby House at 10:25. Adrien admits now that he walked there meaning to confront Enderby, yet failed to mention it until pressed. That is unfortunate." "People are vain when frightened," said Miss Marple. "They prefer to look foolish privately, and so end by looking guilty publicly. You have an explanation for everything. Only for ordinary weakness. It is so very repetitive." He consulted his notebook. "There is more. In Gresham's desk we found a letter from Enderby demanding a meeting regarding matters materially affecting succession and reputation. That strengthens motive. The dispatch box marked CV is still missing. Mrs. Gresham says it may have been destroyed with old papers. The housekeeper disagrees. What precisely do you know of Clara Vale? Asked Miss Marple. Very little that is not gossip. She came as companion to Lady Gresham in 1947. In September 1948, she vanished. The village was told she had proved unsuitable and gone away. There were rumours of theft and of an entanglement with Philip Gresham. No complaint was made, no relative pressed inquiry. No money, no mother, no respectable advocate, said Miss Marple. That often amounts to vanishing by permission. When Craddock had gone to the hall, Dr. Collier called, nominally to see whether Florence had slept, actually because he wanted to know what Miss Marple knew. They stood on the lawn under the laburnum, yellow petals dropping around them like scraps of faded silk. You were practicing here in 1948, were you not? Miss Marple asked. I had just joined old Dr. Maddox. Then you must remember Clara Vale. He folded his hat brim once. Slightly. A pretty girl, too much discussed. Did she leave the district? So I was told. By Lady Gresham? By several people. Several people are wonderfully useful when nobody wishes to be individually responsible, said Miss Marple. Was there ever an inquiry? His face changed. It was a different time. The times change less than people think, she said. Only the expressions alter. He looked at her then with weary honesty. If you are asking whether we all found it easier to accept a convenient version, the answer is yes. I have disliked that answer for years. The admission told her more than anything florid would have done. By afternoon, the Women's Institute had converted what should have been a jam-judging rehearsal into a symposium of faulty theories. Mrs. Harbottle was certain Adrien wanted to suppress evidence affecting inheritance. Miss Weatherby believed Philip Gresham had secretly married Clara because she remembered him buying carnations on a Tuesday. Mrs. Pike thought Sylvia central because quiet girls always are in stories. The retired colonel suspected radicals. Through it all, Miss Marple crocheted a strip of blue wool and said almost nothing. At last, Mrs. Pike declared, if Clara did show herself at the schoolhouse window that night, somebody there must have let her in. Miss Marple looked up. Did she show herself there, Mrs. Pike? Who first said so? Mrs. Pike, who never enjoyed having her collective certainties translated into singular names, became offended at once. Everybody said it. Everybody is not a person, said Miss Marple. It is merely a blanket under which timid individuals hide. The room went watchful. Florence changed the subject to raspberry vinegar with visible relief. Toward evening, Miss Marple walked by the meadow past the abandoned schoolhouse. Its east windows faced the grass, caked in old white paint and weather, blind as sealed eyes. They disturbed her. A village may misremember many things, but it seldom invents a face at a window without assistance. Sylvia Dean stood by the gate. She turned sharply. I did not hear you. People listening inwardly seldom do, said Miss Marple. For a moment they looked together at the painted glass. They look blind, Sylvia said. Yes, houses do when they have been made to keep secrets. Sylvia took a crumpled note from her bag. Mr. Enderbe wrote to me last week. I did not tell the inspector. Miss Marple read. Before long, Miss Dean, you may discover that your life in Wych Elm began much earlier than you suppose. There are witnesses still, though a town may lose sight of them. I advise discretion until I have arranged matters. Why did you keep this back? She asked. Because I thought it was cruelty, or madness. Mrs. Gresham has always been good to me, and yet, Sylvia broke off, I have never quite known why. And you fear the explanation may not be kind. Sylvia gave a small, helpless gesture. He looked at me as if I was something filed incorrectly. If this is connected with Clara Vale, if I am connected, do not decide too soon what the truth will do to you, said Miss Marple gently. Humiliation and justice sometimes arrive in the same parcel. Footsteps sounded behind them. Adrien Gresham came quickly across the meadow path and stopped when he saw them. Miss Dean, I've been looking for you. Craddock says Enderbe found documents at the hall. Did he approach you? Sylvia drew herself up. That is no affair of yours. If it affects the hall, it is very much my affair. Then, with visible effort, he moderated. I'm not trying to bully you. I'm trying to prevent more damage. Miss Marple asked, "Did your aunt ever speak kindly of Clara Vale?" The abruptness of the question checked him. Kindly? No, never. When she spoke of her at all, it was as one speaks of a stain that has somehow returned after cleaning. A farm boy came racing over the meadow then, shouting that Inspector Craddock wanted Adrien at once. Another search of Enderbe's rooms had been ordered. Something else appeared to be missing. The suspense in the air tightened like wire. "What now?" Sylvia whispered. Miss Marple looked once more at the painted windows, at the old white coats blistered by sun and age. "Now," she said, "the mystery will grow vulgar before it grows clear. It nearly always does. We must be patient." Section 4. The Convenient Man. The mystery did indeed grow vulgar before it grew clear, and by 6 o'clock that evening it had become perfectly plain to nearly everyone except Miss Marple that Adrien Gresham was the convenient man. News spread tidily. The inspector had searched the lodge. Adrien had gone to Enderbe House that morning. Enderbe had written about succession and reputation. By supper time, every parlour in Wych Elm possessed a polished version of Adrien's guilt. He had been seen leaving by the west gate with blood on his cuff, which was false. He had gambling debts beyond measure, which might have been true in part, but had improved considerably in travel, and he had threatened Enderbe in unmistakable terms, which no one could quite quote, but many admired themselves for remembering. At the lodge wing, Craddock confronted him with Enderbe's letter. "I must see you tomorrow morning without fail, regarding matters materially affecting succession and reputation," he read. "That goes beyond antiquarian fussing." "Yes," said Adrien. "He meant it to. He enjoyed watching people wince." "And the dispatch box?" "I haven't got it." "A pity you forgot to mention walking to Enderbe House until a labourer placed you there." Adrien rose, checked himself, and said with bitterness, "Because I came to bully a spiteful old solicitor, heard a scream, and found him dead, sounds exactly like the sort of thing guilty men improvise. You have the perfect picture, haven't you? Unstable man, family property, public quarrel, dead keeper of secrets. The village must be sleeping magnificently." "Villages rarely sleep magnificently," said Craddock. "They only pretend to." When he came out, Miss Marple was on the terrace with Sylvia Dean, who had been sent on an errand by Celia Gresham, and clearly wished herself anywhere else. "If you are about to tell me this is too obvious, spare me," said Craddock. "Obvious things are not always wrong." "No," said Miss Marple, "only a great many of them." He departed with that. Adrien came down the steps a moment later. "I suppose you have heard that I am the villain of the piece?" "At present, only the first villain," said Miss Marple. "There are often others." He almost smiled. Sylvia did not. "Did you ever know my mother?" she asked him abruptly. The question hit him with visible force. "Your mother?" "No. At least, I don't know who she was." "Nor do I," said Sylvia. "That appears to be the difficulty." He looked from her to Miss Marple. "What exactly has Enderbe been doing?" "What he always did," said Miss Marple, "turning private pain into public recreation." Adrien's mouth hardened. "If he made some vile insinuation to you, Miss Dean, I am sorry. He had a talent for entering a room and fouling it before he sat down." "And your family?" Sylvia said quietly. "Had they no such talent?" He took the blow without resentment. "Possibly every family like mine does. We conceal one thing and call it good breeding, another and call it loyalty. I don't know what happened in 1948. I only know the house has always spoken about it as servants pass a sick room." That night, Celia Gresham sent for Dr. Collier. She received him in the blue morning room with the curtains open onto darkness. It was plain she was too disturbed even for formal hospitality. "If Adrien is charged," she said, "the papers will seize on the old story. Enderbe has made that certain." "You are thinking of yourself," said the doctor, "of the hall, which is more important." He looked at her long enough for the old history between them, whatever mixture of affection, complicity and fatigue it had become, to show itself. "And of Miss Dean?" he asked. "She need know nothing. That decision may no longer be yours." "It was never hers," Celia said sharply. Then, as if hearing herself, she added with effort, "I took her in. I provided for her." "Yes," said Dr. Collier. "That is what we told ourselves gratitude would look like." The next morning, the case against Adrien seemed to harden. A constable discovered the tin dispatch box hidden behind broken tiles in Adrien's cart shed. It had been forced open and emptied. Craddock came straight to Florence Dane's gate with the news. "Then it is Adrien," Florence cried. "It must be." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was looking at the inspector's wet boots. "You crossed the lower orchard," she said. "The grass is drenched there. Was the box wet?" "No, dry, in fact." "Then it was not put in the shed until later in the morning, after the dew had gone. That is the sort of detail planted evidence forgets. A man who kills in temper does not usually pause to hide motive in his own outbuilding." Craddock stared, then nodded slowly. "You think the box was planted?" "I think someone is being extremely helpful to suspicion." The inspector had Adrien released from immediate watch, though not from mistrust. The village disliked the complication. Simpler minds resent any adjustment once they have settled into moral certainty. By evening, Adrien and Sylvia met by chance in the churchyard beneath the yew. "The box was planted," he said. "Even Craddock sees it may have been. If Enderbe wrote to you, if he said anything about the past, you had better tell the inspector. Secrets are becoming too expensive." Sylvia looked toward the hall windows through the trees. "That is easy for a man to say when his name has always fitted him." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't easy at all. But I begin to think not knowing may be worse." She turned then with a bleakness that altered her face. "I have lived there 3 years and never once belonged. Mrs. Gresham has been generous in every way that did not require tenderness. Sometimes I thought she watched me as if I reminded her of a headache she had been trying to cure for years. What sort of beginning does that suggest to you?" "A cruel one," said Adrien. She left him without another word. From among the leaning stones, where lavender and nettles grew together, Miss Marple had seen the exchange. Human beings, she reflected, often go to churchyards when they want honesty, but not company. It seldom works. Someone always sees. As she walked home through the late light, the shape of the case displeased her more than ever. Adrien was plausible, yes, too plausible. The empty box in his shed was neat, dutiful, and morally improving in exactly the way villagers enjoy. And beneath that visible tidiness lingered something older and less respectable. The sense that the story of Clara Vale had itself been arranged long ago for public convenience. What interested Miss Marple now was not who had been deceived by that arrangement, but who had needed it badly enough to create it. Section 5. The Blind Windows. What interested her most was not who had been deceived by it, but who had needed it badly enough to provide it. And with that thought alive in her mind, Miss Marple spent the next morning following not the murder itself, but the shape of the older falsehood behind it. She began, characteristically, with tea. At 10:30 she called on Edith Vale, taking with her a jar of gooseberry jelly from Florence Dane, under the pretext of exchanging recipes. Edith received her in the polished severity of Enderbe House's back sitting room, where everything remained in exact order except the atmosphere. That was raw with contained anger. "They'll pull the place to bits before they're done," Edith said. "Men always do when they're calling it investigation." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and women do much the same under the name of helping. It is a weakness of the race." She admired the whiteness of the curtains, the neat basket of mending, the tray already set for one. "You keep things beautifully." "Somebody had to." Miss Marple allowed the silence to ripen, then said, "I was sorry to hear Clara was your cousin." Edith's hands stiffened on the jelly jar. "There was no use saying so before." "No, People are never tenderer than when they are discussing another woman's disgrace. Edith gave a hard little breath that might almost have been a laugh. You know villages, then? Intimately. Did Clara care for Philip Gresham? The older woman's face altered in a way that told more than words. A careful, dried life briefly showed the track of an old wound. She was only 22, Edith said, and he was the sort that made girls think gentleness and breeding must mean honour. Did he mean to marry her? Edith turned away to the dresser. What good is that question now? A great deal, if somebody killed Mr. Enderbe over what he found. Edith's voice flattened. Mr. Enderbe liked old sins because they cost him nothing. He never cared a rap for Clara, only for possessing the tale before others did. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. I think that is true. By the way, you were very certain about the jam on the cup. Edith looked back sharply. Because Agnes is a fool. Of course. Yet most women in your place would have said merely that Agnes was mistaken. They would not have known whether the red mark was jam unless they had examined it rather closely. For one instant Edith said nothing. Then, I had to wash the plate. Indeed. Miss Marple rose as if the point were trivial. I do hope the police are not too clumsy with your cupboards. One hates seeing orderly lives poured over. As she went out through the scullery, her eye caught upon a shelf where jars stood ranked like soldiers. Red currant jelly, blackberry, quince. On the end of the shelf, apart from the rest, there was a blue and white biscuit plate with a faint chip shaped like a crescent moon. The sort of plate, she thought, on which one might set 2 jam biscuits for a private interview one intended to enjoy. From Edith Vale she went to the vicarage again, where the photograph of the schoolhouse proved, under a magnifying glass borrowed from the vicar's study, even more decisive. The paint on the east windows had not merely dulled the panes, it had been laid on in solid coats. No face, Clara Vale's or anyone else's, could have been seen there in September 1948. The famous sighting, so lovingly repeated by Wych for nearly 30 years, was impossible. Inspector Craddock arrived just as the vicar was apologising for weak tea. Miss Marple handed him the photograph. There is your hidden clue, Inspector, or one of them. Mr. Enderbe wrote that the village should not go on closing its eyes. It appears the village began by pretending its eyes had seen what glass could not show. He studied the image, frowned, and then frowned again, which with him meant genuine interest. If the windows were painted shut, then someone invented the witness, or the witnesses. Why? Because a woman had to be known to have gone away, not remained nearby under somebody's management. When no train ticket, no luggage, no reliable farewell exists, villages often produce sight in place of evidence. I saw her at such and such a place, someone says, and the statement becomes a footbridge everyone crosses without testing. Craddock put the photograph carefully into his notebook. And Enderbe knew this? Either knew it then or discovered it now. You think he was involved? Miss Marple's old hands folded over one another. I think he enjoyed the power of being in the know. Men who do often begin as errand boys for older people's cruelties and end by calling themselves custodians of truth. That afternoon the motif of windows evolved again. In the square, curtains twitched not merely with curiosity, but with unease. Once a village lie is touched, even gently, every other household invention begins to feel its hinges loosen. Miss Weatherby remembered that it had actually been Mrs. Pike who first repeated the schoolhouse sighting. Mrs. Pike instantly denied this, and said the story came from Lucius Enderbe himself, then parish clerk, and forever passing messages for Lady Gresham. The curate's wife recalled, with a thrill of belated discomfort, that old Dr. Maddox had once told her sharply not to encourage melodrama about the hall. Each memory emerged half ashamed, as though people had gone into their attics and found there not heirlooms, but cheap stage properties. At Gresham Hall, matters were becoming less manageable. Sylvia had asked Celia directly, in the small tapestry room where account books were usually kept, whether Clara Vale had borne a child. Celia's head came up at once. Who put that into your mind? No one had to. They put everything else there and left the shape of that empty. You are overwrought. No, I'm tired of being treated as though gratitude should be enough to keep me ignorant. Sylvia's voice shook once and steadied. Did she bear a child? Celia turned a page in the ledger before her without seeing it. If she did, it has nothing whatever to do with you. The cruelty of that answer lay not in denial, but in its effort to close the door before Sylvia could reach it. Sylvia stood motionless. Then it does, she said. Otherwise, you would have lied better. Celia looked up, and for the first time the authority in her seemed strained by something dangerously like panic. Mind yourself. There are facts which, once spoken, do not improve anyone's life. Perhaps not yours, Sylvia said, and walked out. She nearly ran into Dr. Collier in the hall. He took one look at her face and led her, without speaking, into the library. There he shut the door and waited. It was an old physician's trick, and not an unkind one. I cannot breathe in that house, she said at last. Then do not stay in it this afternoon, he returned. You know. He did not answer directly. I know there was cowardice in 1948, and that cowardice called itself necessity. She stared. Am I Clara Vale's child? The silence that followed was so long she felt the answer before he gave it. I believe you are, he said. The room shifted. Later, Sylvia would remember the pattern of faded bindings behind him, the smell of leather and summer dust, the thin, bright line of the window latch. But at the moment, there was only the strange sensation that one had been standing all one's life on a floor which turned out, under the first honest footstep, to be a trapdoor. And Mrs. Gresham knew? Yes. All these years? Yes. She laughed then, but the sound frightened him. How kind she has been! He said heavily. Kindness is not always clean. By evening, Inspector Craddock had another piece of the puzzle. Among the burnt odds and ends in Enderbe's study grate, preserved because the maid had not emptied it before the murder, he found a scrap of envelope addressed to St. Anne's Home, Exeter, and the letters C. Vale. Miss Marple, when told, merely nodded. A home for unmarried mothers, perhaps, said Craddock, or mothers whom other people preferred not to see. The distinction is often administrative rather than moral. If Sylvia Dean is Clara's daughter, why bring her back to the hall? Guilt, Inspector. Guilt is untidy. It cannot alter the original cruelty, so it performs smaller acts and calls them reparation. Taking a young woman in as companion is safer than naming her as kin. He paced once across Florence Dane's parlour and back. Then our dead man found proof of Sylvia's identity. That threatens Mrs. Gresham, perhaps Gresham's inheritance, perhaps the doctor's reputation if he helped conceal it. Plenty of motive. And Edith Vale, said Miss Marple. Craddock stopped. The housekeeper? A cousin may carry outrage longer than employers expect. Besides, she was peculiarly interested in the mark on the cup. You suspect her? I notice her. That is not quite the same thing. He gave her a narrow look. With you, it usually becomes the same thing later. Yet if the blind windows proved the old lie, they also sharpened the new danger. Someone had already planted the dispatch box in Adrien's shed. Someone was trying to shape the case even now. Miss Marple felt, with that cold, inward certainty she disliked but trusted, that the matter would not rest there. When people have once lived for years behind closed curtains, they do not pull them back halfway and stop. They either surrender to the light or tear the room to pieces, keeping it out. Section 6. Rooms long kept shut. They either surrender to the light or tear the room to pieces, keeping it out, and by the next day the household at the hall was doing both at once. Celia Gresham had not slept. Her maid, who had attended her since the year of the general strike and considered moral collapse an indecorous novelty, later reported that Mrs. Gresham dismissed her at dawn and stood for nearly an hour at the west window, looking toward the old schoolhouse. When Sylvia appeared at breakfast, pale and composed in that dangerous way young women sometimes are, when they have passed beyond tears into decision. Celia dismissed the servants and said with effort, "Dr. Collier should not have spoken to you." Sylvia buttered a piece of toast she did not intend to eat. "Then you had better speak yourself." Celia's hands lay on the cloth, beautifully kept hands still, though the skin had grown fine and dry as old paper. "Your mother was Clara Vale. My brother Philip was responsible." She drew breath. "There was to have been a marriage. There were reasons." "Convenient ones?" "Serious ones. My mother was ill. Philip was due abroad. Clara became hysterical." "Because she was carrying his child?" Celia's eyes flinched, then hardened. "Yes. And so she was sent away like bad silver." The cruelty of the phrase struck home because it was exact. Celia looked suddenly much older. "You know nothing of what the world was then." "No," said Sylvia, "only what you made of it." Celia rose. "I arranged for her care. I paid. When she died in Exeter after your birth, I saw that you were properly placed. Years later I found you again. I brought you here. I have done what could be done." "You brought me into the house that lied about her," said Sylvia, her voice scarcely louder than breath, "and never once told me why I seemed to hurt your eyes." She went out before Celia could answer. In the corridor she passed Adrien. He had clearly heard enough to understand the broad outline and not enough to know where to put his own feeling within it. He caught up with her at the stair-foot. "Sylvia," she turned, "am I to call you cousin now, or would that damage the curtains?" He took the insult without defending himself. "If you like, damage them. God knows they deserve it." Something in his face, honest bewilderment perhaps, or the refusal to pretend comfort where there was none, made her stop. "Did you know?" "No, not until it began to glimmer these last 2 days. I knew only that the house was full of some old shame everyone expected me to inherit without explanation." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then you are luckier than I am. You inherited the house first." Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was confronting Dr. Collier in the surgery, the room smelling of tinctures, dust, and polished restraint. "Did you attend Clara Vale in Exeter?" Dr. Collier, with his hand on the medicine cupboard, paused only once before saying, "Yes." "At St. Anne's home?" "For one visit. Old Maddox handled the arrangement. Lady Gresham preferred distance." "Was there a marriage between Clara and Philip Gresham?" The doctor's face changed by degrees, as a sky changes before rain. "I never saw the certificate. Philip told me he meant to make things right. Whether he managed it before shipping out, I do not know." "Why was the village told Clara had run away after theft?" The doctor's answer was so quiet that it was more damning than heat. "Because that version required less courage from everyone involved." Craddock said, "You are describing more than gossip. You are describing collusion." "Yes." "Including yours?" "Including mine." That honesty, arriving late, irritated the inspector more than a lie might have done. And now Enderbe finds something. Letters, records, proof of a child. He is murdered. Why should I not think you killed him to keep the past buried? Dr. Collier met his eyes. "Because if I had meant to keep it buried, I should have done so 28 years ago, when I still had youth to call conscience impractical. Now I only have conscience. It is a thoroughly uncomfortable possession, Inspector, but not generally homicidal." Craddock did not answer. He had the impression, unpleasantly, of a man who might be telling the truth and still be concealing the most important part of it. At Florence Dane's house that afternoon, Miss Marple heard the essentials from Sylvia herself. The girl sat straight-backed in the chintz chair by the window, hands clenched around a teacup gone cold. Florence hovered uselessly with cake. "She said she had done what could be done," Sylvia said, "as if one were a torn sleeve sent out to be mended and brought home decent again." Miss Marple said gently, "That is how some natures understand reparation. They repair the visible thing and never ask whether the fabric resents the stitching. My mother died because they hid her. Perhaps. Or perhaps she died because childbirth was more dangerous then than respectable people remembered when arranging other people's shame. But the concealment was cruel, and cruelty does not become less so because it is tidy." Sylvia's eyes burned suddenly. What am I to do with it? Truth? Endure it first, use it later. That is the usual order, though seldom a pleasant one. There was a knock, and Edith Vale came in without waiting to be fully announced. Her composure was near breaking point. "Miss Marple, may I speak to you alone?" Florence tactfully removed herself, taking the stale cake and her distress with her. Edith looked at Sylvia, and something very like pity crossed her hard face. "You know then," she said. Sylvia answered, "I know enough. Did you know too?" Edith bowed her head once. "Since the day Mrs. Gresham fetched you from the agency, I knew your eyes. Clara had the same when she was trying not to cry." The older woman's mouth worked. "I wanted to tell you many a time, but what right had I to throw it in your face when I could do nothing to mend it?" Sylvia whispered, "You might at least have let me belong to someone." Edith shut her eyes. When she opened them again, she addressed Miss Marple. "Mr. Enderbe sent for me the morning he died. I did not tell the police." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "No, I thought perhaps he had. He said he wanted information about Clara. He had the box open on the table. There were letters and a photograph of her holding a baby. He kept smiling the way he did when he believed himself important, said the fate ought to have a revelation worthy of the village, and that some truths were too pretty to waste on a private solicitor." Edith's hands shook for the first time. He meant to say it all before everybody, to drag Clara out again, and the girl along with her. Sylvia made a small sound. Edith did not look at her. "What happened then?" asked Miss Marple. "I told him he was filth. He laughed, said he'd as good as saved the family years before by helping Lady Gresham construct a proper account. Then Agnes called from the back door that the coal man had come, and I went. When I came back, he was dead." "Yet you said nothing of the interview." "Would you?" Edith flung it almost savagely, with them all ready to make a circus of her life. Miss Marple said, "Did you take the dispatch box then?" Edith stared, too long, too fixedly. "No." It was not convincing. That evening the confrontations spread. Adrien challenged Celia in the library and demanded to know whether Sylvia, if legitimate, had a claim stronger than his own. Celia answered that legalities could be managed. Adrien, to his credit, said with disgust that he was not asking how to cheat her. Dr. Collier, summoned again, refused to be useful, and in the servants' hall Agnes cried because she had not been told the dead companion's daughter was living in the house all along, which she considered a personal injury. Miss Marple sat later by Florence's lamp and thought not of law, but of motive. The current murder had grown from the older secret like fungus from rotten wood, yet the manners of the two crimes felt different. The concealment of 1948 was cold, social, sanctioned by class and cowardice. The killing of Lucius Enderbe, she thought, had been hot for an instant, almost primitive in its indignation. The old sundial top was not a weapon prepared by calculation. It had lain ready to hand, seized in fury by someone who felt the dead man had forfeited the right to speak another word. That narrowed feeling, if not yet the person, rage of that kind belongs to the protective, the shamed, the loving, the humiliated. One does not smash a man with a piece of stone because of inheritance alone. One does it because he has laid dirty fingers on the one thing in the world one cannot bear to see mishandled again. Outside, the hall windows shone and darkened one by one. Rooms long kept shut were opening at last, but stale air, Miss Marple knew, does not leave gently. It billows out with dust, and often with fire close behind. Section 7. Light in the schoolhouse. It billowed out with dust, and often with fire close behind, and before midnight a red stain rose suddenly against the trees beyond the meadow, so that for one dreadful minute Wych Elm thought the hall itself was burning. It was not the hall, it was the old schoolhouse. The alarm bell in the square clanged with antiquated zeal. Men ran in shirt-sleeves, women in cardigans over nightdresses, children barefoot and thrilled until they saw adult faces and understood excitement had become something else. Miss Marple, wrapped in a dark coat over her flannel gown, came with Florence as far as the meadow gate and no farther. At her age, one learns that rushing to the centre seldom improves observation. From there, she watched the flames beat behind the painted east windows until suddenly one pane burst outward and a tongue of orange curled through the blind white frame like a trapped witness finding voice too late. Buckets travelled hand to hand. Adrien Gresham was among the first at the pump, stripped to shirt sleeves and blackened already with smoke. Dr. Collier shouted for more water. Inspector Craddock, summoned from his bed at Market Basing and arriving with unpleasant speed, began at once separating practical effort from picturesque alarm. Sylvia stood beside Edith Vale under the elder trees, her face lit and extinguished by the blaze. Celia Gresham had not come, whether from pride, fear, or genuine faintness nobody could say. When at last the fire was beaten back to smoking beams and hissing timber, Craddock went in with a constable and Adrien. The smell that came out was of wet ash, old paper, and scorched paint. Near what had once been the schoolmaster's desk lay the charred remains of the tin dispatch box. Most of its contents were gone to black flakes. Yet two things had survived by the mean obstinacy of partly covered paper. Half a photograph of a young woman seated in a deck chair, holding an infant wrapped in a knitted shawl, and the corner of a document bearing the words Philip Gresham and Clara Ann Vale. The effect upon the watchers outside was instant and ugly. Here was not mere murder now, but drama with relics. The old scandal had burst into actual flame. Mrs. Pike, who had somehow arrived in curl papers under a rainproof cape, whispered audibly that the schoolhouse had been chosen because Clara hid there. The curate's wife shushed her, and then asked whether the child in the photograph might be Sylvia. Agnes began to cry. Mr. Bolter swore he had seen a figure crossing the meadow 10 minutes before the alarm. Everyone wanted to be the first useful witness in a town that had so long made do with false ones. Craddock came out carrying the half-photograph in an envelope. His face, streaked with soot, had lost its patience. Who was here before the fire was noticed? Half a dozen people answered at once and contradicted one another. Adrien said he had seen light while returning from the lower paddock. Edith said she had smelt smoke from Enderbe House and run toward it. Sylvia said nothing until asked directly, then admitted she had walked as far as the lane because she could not sleep. Dr. Collier confirmed that the door showed signs of forcible opening, but could not say whether that preceded the blaze. Everything, in short, became at once possible and useless. Only one detail struck Miss Marple sharply. Edith Vale, standing very straight with her skirt hem blackened by mud, never once asked what had been found in the box. Not once. She watched Sylvia instead. The second shock redirected the case exactly as the murderer must have hoped. Adrien had been first at the scene, had reason to fear the documents, and had free movement about the estate. By breakfast the next morning, the village theory had swung back to him with renewed satisfaction. Even Craddock, though unconvinced, could not ignore the convenience. If he planted the empty box and then panicked when he thought we were closing in, burning the remnants at the schoolhouse might suit perfectly, he told Miss Marple. Yes, she said, perfectly. That is what worries me. He regarded her with the patient exasperation of a man repeatedly informed that his strongest facts are too tidy. You prefer muddle. I prefer truth. It generally arrives with loose buttons. She asked to see the photograph. In the fragment, the young woman, Clara beyond doubt, held the baby protectively. But what interested Miss Marple most was not the faces, it was the knitted shawl. Fine wool, pale, with a border of tiny window-pane squares in blue. Florence Dane, peering over her shoulder, exclaimed that she had once seen exactly that pattern in old village exhibition books, worked by Edith Vale's mother. A family thing, said Florence. The Vales called it the witness shawl because of the little panes. Fancy that. Miss Marple's eyes lifted at once. Motif met motive with almost indecent neatness. Later that day she visited the hall and found Sylvia in the morning room where Celia sat like an exhausted queen who has mislaid both crown and army. Inspector Craddock tells me part of the marriage paper survived, said Celia without greeting. He also informs me that if the certificate proves valid, there may be legal consequences. Everyone now looks at my walls as though measuring them for division. Sylvia stood by the window, not turning. Perhaps walls should be looked at plainly for once. Celia closed her eyes briefly. If you intend vengeance, at least have the honesty to say so. Then Sylvia turned. There was no triumph in her face, only a hollow astonishment that seemed to accuse all older people equally. Vengeance? You still think this is about property? Celia opened her mouth and shut it again. For the first time in years, she looked not commanding, but ignorant. Adrien came in unannounced. The inspector wants everyone in reach this afternoon. Mrs. Pike has been telling half the square she saw a lantern at the schoolhouse. Mrs. Pike sees destiny whenever anyone else's life catches fire, said Celia. Adrien ignored the remark. His gaze moved to Sylvia. I'm sorry about the photograph, she said after a pause. So am I. I had no idea one could grieve for a face known only through other people's dishonesty. That sentence stayed with Miss Marple long after she left the hall. It seemed to contain the whole emotional core of the affair. The dead girl stolen once by concealment, and now nearly stolen again by spectacle. Toward evening, Miss Marple went alone to the meadow path and stood looking at the blackened schoolhouse. The east windows, blistered and cracked now, were more blind than ever. Yet through one broken pane, the interior lay exposed. Charred desk, fallen plaster, the obscene cleanliness with which fire strips a place of pretense. It came to her then that the arson had not really been aimed at destroying all evidence. Too much had been left. The half-photograph, the marriage fragment, even the melodramatic choice of the schoolhouse, these were displays as much as erasures. Someone wanted the past visible, but visible in a way that would continue to distort it. A soft tread sounded on the path behind her. It was Edith Vale. You shouldn't be here alone at your age, Edith said. Nor you at yours, returned Miss Marple. Yet here we both are. Edith looked at the ruin. They've had enough out of her. Whom do you mean, Clara or Sylvia? Edith's mouth trembled once and set hard. Both? Yes, said Miss Marple. That is what I thought. Edith turned quickly. I don't know what you mean. No? Then perhaps we had better have tea tomorrow. I find many things look different once the kettle has boiled. Edith gave her a strange look, half defiance and half fatigue, and went away without answering. Miss Marple watched her until the dusk took her into itself. The second shock had done its work. Suspicion had been redirected, evidence theatrically damaged, and the village invited once again to peer at a woman through the wrong pane of glass. But the very choice of that schoolhouse, with its history of false sighting, seemed to Miss Marple less like cleverness than compulsion. Someone in Wych Elm was still trying to control not merely what had happened, but how the village saw it. And that, in her experience, was nearly always the habit of a person who had once been helpless before the same crowd and had never forgiven the spectacle. Section 8. The Kindness of Knitting. Someone in Wych Elm was still trying to control not merely what had happened, but how the village saw it, and walking home from the meadow with that conviction settled firmly inside her, Miss Marple decided to do what she most often did when human beings became theatrical. She would offer tea and ask them to be ordinary. The invitation to Edith Vale went out the next morning on Florence Dane's cream notepaper. Would you come at 11? I am troubled about a knitting pattern and think you may remember it better than anyone. There is sponge cake. Florence, who understood by now that Miss Marple's domestic inquiries were seldom domestic for long, sent it without comment. Edith arrived precisely at 11, in a brown hat and dark gloves, dressed like a woman determined not to invite sympathy. Florence produced tea and cake, lingered heroically, and at the first signal allowed herself to be drawn into the garden to inspect an imaginary blight on the roses. Miss Marple had arranged her little trap with characteristic innocence. On the side table lay a basket of wool, the faded photograph from the vicarage album showing the painted schoolhouse windows in 1948, and a baby's shawl borrowed from Florence's linen press. It was not Clara's, but it suggested the sort of thing. Edith's eyes touched the photograph immediately. You wish to ask about knitting, Miss Marple? Yes, dear Edith. Florence tells me the Vales had a charming window pane pattern for baby shawls. Such a pretty name, little witness windows all round a child. Country people name patterns after anything, Edith said. Indeed, and yet the fragment found in the schoolhouse showed just such a border, did it not? Little blue squares. One saw at once the child had been wrapped in something from home. Edith looked involuntarily. Only half the border showed, the rest was scorched off. Miss Marple let the wool slip into her lap. Yes, she said mildly. How carefully you remember. Edith knew she had moved too quickly. The knowledge crossed her face and was gone, but not before Miss Marple saw it. The inspector showed it about enough, Edith said. Not to you. I asked him yesterday. He had not. He is old-fashioned in some things. Would you like more tea? Silence followed. Miss Marple knitted a few rows, giving the silence room to work. People often confess not because they are pressed, but because the politeness of being waited for becomes unbearable. At last, Edith said, If you mean to accuse me, you may as well do it cleanly. I mean only to understand why a woman who has protected one girl all her life should choose the schoolhouse to burn papers in. It was a cruel place to choose, unless she meant the town to remember what lie began there. Edith looked at her with the bleak exhaustion of someone hearing a private labour named aloud. I didn't want them to remember the lie, she said. I wanted them to stop living by it. Miss Marple said nothing. They made a picture, Edith went on. That was all the village ever needed. Clara at the blind window, Clara running, Clara stealing. Once they had that picture, no one needed to ask who painted it. Mr. Enderbe helped paint it. He was only a clerk then, running errands for Lady Gresham, but he loved being useful to people above him. Afterward, he loved remembering how useful he'd been. Who first said Clara had been seen at the schoolhouse? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Enderbe, in the post office, where he knew Mrs. Pike would hear. By evening there were 6 witnesses. By morning the whole town had them. Clara was never there. She was in Exeter at St. Anne's, frightened and ill, and writing letters no one wanted to answer honestly. The old clock ticked in the hall. Outside, a bicycle went past, humming badly. The ordinary sound made the confession inside more terrible. And Sylvia? Miss Marple asked. Edith swallowed. Clara died 3 days after the child was born. Fever, they said. I went down once because my mother begged me to. There was a shawl my mother had knitted for the baby. Clara cried when she saw it. Said if the child had one thing from home, perhaps she wouldn't grow up altogether among strangers. I held the baby. Sylvia has her eyes. And Mr. Enderbe found the papers. Letters, a photograph, one from Philip saying he'd married Clara quietly in London before he shipped out. He meant to send for her later. Then he was killed. Lady Gresham knew of the marriage. Enderbe knew. Stephen Collier suspected. Nobody wanted the truth because the truth made the Greshams ridiculous and Clara respectable, and that was exactly the wrong way round for Wych Elm. Miss Marple folded her hands over the knitting. Did you take the dispatch box after Mr. Enderbe was killed? Edith looked up. Yes. Why? Because he'd just told me what he meant to do. Stand up at the fete with the brass band and bunting and announce that Clara hadn't been a thief after all, only a servant girl promoted by paper and a bastard child turned heir. They'd have devoured the truth exactly as they'd devoured the lie. Sylvia would have had every eye in the place measuring her like goods at market. I thought of her first. I always have. So you planted the empty box in Adrien's shed? Yes. I told myself suspicion would do him less harm than exposure would do her. It was wicked, I know that. But I thought if the police fussed about inheritance, they might leave the girl alone long enough for me to decide what to do. Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. You have told me why you took the papers. You have not told me why Mr. Enderbe died. Edith's gloved hands tightened. For a moment, she looked as though she might refuse. Then the refusal went out of her. Because he smiled, she said. Miss Marple did not move. He had Clara's photograph in his hand, and that fat, pleased smile on his face. He said she'd make a better sensation dead than alive, and that poor girls were useful because they came twice, once for sin and once for pity. Men say filthy things for relish when they feel safe. He said them. The sundial top was by the lilies. I remember thinking it looked like a stone cake plate. Such a stupid thought. I took it up and struck him before he had quite turned toward me. Afterward, everything was quiet. I had not known anger could be so quiet after. The clock ticked on. Agnes was calling in the back passage, Edith said. I set down the stone. I took the box. Later, I hid the papers in the schoolhouse. When the police pressure grew, I meant to burn them all. Then I saw Clara's photograph and the marriage paper again, and I couldn't. If nothing remained, they'd still call her what they always had. So I burned enough to stop the village pawing every page, and left enough to save her honour. That was why I chose the schoolhouse. Let the lie light itself there for once, I thought. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had no softness left in it except pity. Inspector Craddock must be told. I know. Would you rather tell him yourself? Or shall I send for him and remain? Something bleakly grateful passed over Edith's face. Remain. If Sylvia hears, let there be one person in the room who isn't hungry for it. Very well. But you must not dress this up as sacrifice, Edith. It is still murder. Edith gave the faintest smile. You needn't fear. I've never been romantic enough for that. By 12:30, Craddock had heard enough to send for the others. Wych Elm was to have its quiet assembly of truth after all, but not on Lucius Enderby's terms, and not with Bunting. Section 9. The shape of what was seen. Wych Elm was to have its quiet assembly of truth after all, but not on Lucius Enderby's terms, and not with Bunting. And as Inspector Craddock drove back from Florence Dane's house with Edith Vale beside him and Miss Marple in the rear seat, the contradictions of the case began, at last, to settle into their proper order instead of flashing about like loose bits of broken mirror. Craddock did not speak for the first mile. He was a conscientious man, and therefore disliked confessions that relieved his labour while offending his sense of sequence. At length he said, half to himself, it was there from the beginning. The rage, the cup, the box, the schoolhouse. Only everything pointed in two directions at once. That is because there were really two crimes, Inspector, said Miss Marple. One in 1948 and one now. The older one taught everyone concerned the habit of looking sideways. After that, no fact could walk in a straight line. He drove on under the elm shade, thinking. Let us have it plain, he said. You suspected Edith because of the mark on the cup. Partly. She was too exact about the supposed lipstick. Most women would have said merely that Agnes was mistaken. Edith knew it was jam because she had seen the cup closely after the interview, or because she had prepared the tray and knew what should be on it. Either way, she was more deeply in the scene than she admitted. Then there was her relation to Clara, her silence about the morning summons, and, most tellingly of all, her complete lack of curiosity after the schoolhouse fire. People uninvolved always ask the wrong questions. The involved ask none, because they already know which answers are dangerous. Craddock nodded once. And the planted box? Too theatrical for Adrien. He is vain and impulsive, but not domestic in his cunning. Planting evidence in one's own shed is the sort of stupid thing villagers attribute to suspects, because they enjoy the moral lesson of it. Edith, on the other hand, lives by hiding and managing objects. Such women can move whole histories in biscuit tins without rattling the teaspoons. Edith said without bitterness. That's true enough. Miss Marple continued. The dry box in the damp shed told us it had been planted later. The schoolhouse fire told us the owner of the papers had changed from wanting them hidden to wanting them shaped. That was not mere panic. It was argument. Edith wished to save Sylvia from spectacle, and yet to leave Clara some shred of justice. Only a person emotionally divided in exactly that way would burn documents and preserve fragments. Craddock glanced in the mirror. You make murder sound like darning. Not at all. Darning can be done well. Murder is nearly always a botched repair. When they reached Gresham Hall, the afternoon had turned white and windless. The gravel seemed too bright. Craddock asked that Adrien, Celia Gresham, Sylvia Dean, and Dr. Collier assemble in the drawing room. Florence Dane, by firm self-invitation, came as far as the hall and was told with unexpected kindness by Miss Marple that she might remain in the little morning room next door. Florence, who longed equally to hear everything and to preserve her nerves, accepted with gratitude and the door ajar. The drawing room itself was one of those long, handsome rooms whose proportions can survive almost any moral catastrophe. Pale carpets, portraits darkened by time, a marble chimney-piece, French windows onto the terrace. Yet each person in it altered the air differently. Celia Gresham sat very upright on the sofa, her hands clasped around a folded handkerchief she had no intention of using. Dr. Collier stood by the mantel, tired to the edge of transparency. Adrien moved restlessly from window to chair and back again, bringing nervous life into a room built for control. Sylvia stood apart, one hand on the back of a straight chair, as if choosing to remain standing in the life she had just discovered, because sitting might imply acceptance. Edith came in last, and did not look at anyone until she saw Sylvia. Then her face gentled and hardened in the same instant. Craddock said, formal and curt, "Miss Vale has made a statement which it is better you should all hear in the proper order. Miss Marple has, as usual, assisted that order." Adrien muttered, "God help us," though whether the appeal was to heaven or to Miss Marple herself remained unclear. Miss Marple did not begin at the murder. She began, as she must, with the windows. "The trouble with villages," she said, "is that they are so certain they have seen everything. In fact, they have usually seen only what it was convenient to describe. In 1948, when Clara Vale disappeared from Wych Elm, the story most people accepted was that she had been seen at the old schoolhouse window and later gone off in disgrace. It was a useful story. It allowed Lady Gresham's household to avoid scandal, the village to enjoy scandal, and no one at all to trouble themselves with pity. Unfortunately, it was not true. The east windows of the schoolhouse had been painted shut before Clara vanished. They could not show a face. The witnesses were invented. Celia's eyelids flickered. Adrien stopped pacing. Miss Marple went on. Clara was not at the schoolhouse. She was in Exeter, at St. Anne's home, having been sent away because she was carrying Philip Gresham's child. Philip had in fact married her privately before embarkation. That made her not a seducer, but a wife, and her child not an embarrassment, but an heir. Those facts were intolerable to certain respectable minds, so another version was produced. Mr. Enderbe helped produce it. Dr. Collier closed his eyes briefly. Celia said, in a voice so controlled it was nearly voiceless, "You speak as though you understand the pressure under which people acted. You do not." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple, "I understand it extremely well. That is why I know pressure is no excuse whatever for cruelty arranged with stationery and good manners." No one moved. "Years later," she continued, "you brought Sylvia Dean into this house. Not openly as kin, because that would have required confession. You brought her as companion, which allowed charity to stand where justice should have stood." At that, Sylvia's fingers tightened on the chair back until the knuckles showed white. Celia's face altered with something more wounding than anger, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that the sentence was exact. "Mr. Enderbe discovered the old correspondence among papers after Lady Gresham's death," said Miss Marple. "Instead of giving them quietly to the family or the girl concerned, he chose to enjoy them. He hinted, postponed, arranged. He intended, from what Edith tells us, and from his note about restoring more than the church porch, to make a spectacle of revelation at the fete. On the morning of his death, he sent for Edith Vale, Clara's cousin. He showed her the papers. He laughed. That was his mistake. Edith spoke then, not to defend herself, but because the truth had reached the point where silence would have been an uglier thing than speech. He said Clara would be a better sensation dead than alive. He said poor girls were useful because they came twice, once for sin and once for pity. Adrien swore under his breath. Sylvia shut her eyes. "Edith killed him in a moment of rage," said Miss Marple. "There was no elaborate plan. The sundial top lay near the lilies. She struck him with it. Then, hearing Agnes in the house and already thinking of Sylvia, she took the dispatch box. Later she emptied it, planted the empty box in Adrien's shed to draw suspicion in a direction she thought survivable, and hid the contents in the schoolhouse. When the police pressure grew and the village appetite sharpened, she set fire to the papers there. But she could not bear to destroy them entirely. She left enough of the photograph and certificate to preserve Clara's honour, while burning enough to protect Sylvia from a feast of details. That is why the schoolhouse was chosen. The place of the false witness became the place where the truth, half saved and half destroyed, was forced into view. Celia's breath came audibly for the first time. "You sanctify her because she acted for feeling." "No," said Miss Marple, "I distinguish, that is all. Murder remains murder. But there is a difference between killing to possess and killing because one more desecration of the helpless becomes unendurable. Courts do not always find it comfortable, nor should they. Still, it exists." Craddock, who had been watching faces more closely than words, saw then the one he most needed to see. Not Edith's, which had already surrendered, nor Sylvia's, which was numb with grief, but Celia's. Under the blow of Edith's confession, there was something in Celia less like outrage than loss. She was not merely hearing that a man had been killed. She was hearing that the entire structure of justified concealment by which she had lived since 1948 had been judged, finally, publicly, and found vile. That, Miss Marple knew, was the true assembly of truth. Not facts lined on a table, but the moment each soul must recognise its own arrangement among them. Section 10. What the window held. That, Miss Marple knew, was the true assembly of truth. Not facts lined on a table, but the moment each soul must recognise its own arrangement among them. And because no one in the drawing room could escape that recognition any longer, the explanation went on with the calm inevitability of a curtain being drawn fully back from a window long kept half-shuttered. Inspector Craddock said quietly, "Miss Vale, you understand I shall have to charge you." "Yes," said Edith. But before he could proceed, Sylvia spoke for the first time since the explanation began. "Wait." The single word, low and unsteady though it was, had more authority in it than any command Celia Gresham had issued in the room for years. Everyone turned. Sylvia had not moved from the chair back she held, yet something in her posture had changed utterly. She no longer looked like a girl accidentally overhearing the unpleasant end of other people's history. She looked like the person history had been waiting for and had feared. "I want it told plainly," she said. "All of it. Not because I enjoy it, because if anything remains fogged over, they will go on making me up for themselves. I am tired of living in other people's versions." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Quite right. Then let us be plain." She turned, not to Edith first, but to Celia Gresham. "Your brother Philip married Clara Vale. Whether he meant the marriage impulsively or honourably hardly matters now. He did it. He then went abroad and died. Clara, pregnant and legally his widow, became a threat to the family's dignity. Lady Gresham, with Mr. Enderby's assistance, and with Dr. Maddox and Dr. Collier lending the silence professionals so often call prudence, arranged for Clara to be sent to Exeter. When she died, the child was placed out and the village was given a story it could relish. Later, when guilt matured into something like responsibility, you located the child and brought her back here, not as your niece by marriage, but as a dependent. That allowed you to atone without surrendering control. Celia's face had become almost colourless, but her eyes burned. "You say control as if it were a vice. It was the only thing any of us had left. My mother would have died of the scandal. The estate was burdened. Philip had behaved like a fool. What was I to do? Throw open the doors, proclaim a servant girl as mistress of the hall, and watch the whole county feed upon us?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "something very like that. It would have been unpleasant. Justice generally is to those who have postponed it." The sentence landed with a force beyond its volume. Adrien stared at his aunt as though he were seeing, not her merely, but the entire architecture of his upbringing stripped to beams. "And me?" he said. "I was meant to go on living in the house built on that lie?" Celia turned on him with a flare of the old imperiousness. You have lived in comfort enough. Do not cultivate righteousness because it has become fashionable. Comfort, he said, and laughed once, incredulously. No, Aunt Celia. Uncertainty, yes. Dependence, certainly. But not comfort. We all paid for your order in different coin, didn't we? Clara in exile, Sylvia in ignorance, Edith in silence, Stephen in self-contempt, and I in the perpetual sense of having inherited something sticky without being told what it was. Dr. Collier bowed his head. The truth of the indictment required no answer. Miss Marple turned then to Edith. You carried Clara's memory through all those years. You saw Sylvia brought back into the very house that had destroyed her mother, and had to hold your peace because any truth you told would have been dismissed as a servant cousin's bitterness. Then Mr. Enderbe found the papers and chose amusement over decency. You killed him because in that moment he was not merely an old blackmailer, he was the village all over again, laughing over a helpless girl's ruin. Edith's face crumpled at last, not theatrically, but with the dreadful plainness of a person who has ceased rationing feeling because there is no point now. Yes, she said, that's what it was. Not just him, all of them. The whole room, the whole year, the whole lot of it. Clara begging not to be sent away. My mother saying we mustn't speak too loud or we'd make it worse. Lady Gresham sending money as if money could stand in a cradle. Mr. Enderbe coming after year, to taste the secret like preserved fruit. He'd open a cupboard and smile. Every time he smiled, I saw Clara again. That morning when he held up the photograph and said the fate would be worth attending after all. Her voice broke, recovered roughly. I thought if he said one more word about making a show of her, I should go mad. Perhaps I did for a minute. Sylvia's eyes filled, but she did not look away. Why did you never tell me? Edith turned to her with a tenderness so starved and fierce that even Florence, listening next door, began to cry soundlessly into her handkerchief. Because I couldn't bear for you to know by halves, Edith said, and I never had enough of the whole to give you cleanly. If I'd told you your mother was Clara and left you still dependent on them for your bread, what would that have made you? A grievance in your own place. I kept waiting for a proper time. Then there never was one, only this horrid late one. You might have trusted me, Sylvia whispered. No, said Edith. I didn't trust the village. There's a difference. That was the psychological twist, and it struck the room with more force than the confession itself. Edith's silence, long easy to condemn as cowardice or hardness, was revealed as a distorted guardianship, misguided, catastrophic, yet rooted in a love no respectable arrangement had ever permitted itself to name. And Celia's years of generosity, so often admired, stood exposed not as kindness purified by remorse, but as remorse made proprietary. She had kept Sylvia near, not to free her, but to possess the outcome of the wrong, and manage it within drawing-room terms. Miss Marple said very quietly, The town did not lose its witnesses, it trained them. One was invented, many repeated, and the one true witness was taught that speaking would feed the same appetite which had once destroyed Clara. That is the most dreadful thing villages do. They make silence seem like protection, until silence itself becomes the instrument of harm. No one answered. The summer light beyond the French windows had shifted. The lawn seemed suddenly remote, like scenery from another existence. Craddock moved at last, not harshly. Miss Vale, will you come with me, please? Edith nodded. Then, before she went, she crossed the room to Sylvia. She did not attempt an embrace. Perhaps she knew too well that some truths cannot be touched at once. She only said, Your mother loved you before she saw you. She said so. That part no one altered. Sylvia made a choking sound and covered her mouth with her hand. Adrien stepped aside to let Edith pass. In his face there was no condemnation now, only the dazed respect one gives to a person who has done a terrible thing for reasons one both abhors and understands. Dr. Collier held the door. Celia did not move. But as Edith went by, Celia said suddenly, not loud, not proud, and not to save herself, "I am sorry." Edith paused. She did not turn. "You are late," she said, and went out. The words were quiet. They devastated the room more completely than any outcry could have done. When the door had shut, there remained for a few moments only the muffled sounds of the hall and the faint ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel. Then Sylvia drew a long, unsteady breath and looked at Celia. "Was there ever going to be a day," she asked, "when you told me because I had a right to know, and not because the walls gave way?" Celia's lips parted. For once there was no arrangement ready, no phrase of control polished enough to stand between her and the nakedness of the question. "I don't know," she said. That answer, precisely because it was probably the first honest one she had offered Sylvia, seemed to finish something in both of them. Miss Marple rose. She had no wish to remain for the private wreckage that follows public truth. Yet before she reached the door, Sylvia said, "Miss Marple, was my mother happy at all? Or is that too much to ask of the dead?" Miss Marple considered, and because she was Jane Marple, she did not offer comfort where truth, though smaller, could still be merciful. "I think she was happy when she was loved, and unhappy when love was made dependent on other people's pride. That is not a little thing, my dear. It is almost everybody's tragedy in one form or another." Sylvia bowed her head. The answer struck hard because it held neither romance nor dismissal, only the human scale of a life denied its full weight. Miss Marple went out into the hall, where Florence stood blotched and repentant at having heard so much. Beyond the open door, the village summer lay unchanged in appearance, bright as ever, while inside Gresham Hall, the old lie had finally broken under its own careful framing. Section 11. Open again. Beyond the open door, the village summer lay unchanged in appearance, bright as ever, while inside Gresham Hall, the old lie had finally broken under its own careful framing. And because villages resume their surfaces much more quickly than their consciences, Wych Elm began, almost at once, the difficult business of looking ordinary again. Edith Vale was taken to Market Basing that afternoon. Inspector Craddock, whose conscience was both less sentimental and kinder than he liked people to suppose, arranged matters so that she was not paraded through the square. Even so, by evening everyone knew. They knew also, in pieces and inaccuracies, the outline of Clara Vale's marriage, Sylvia's birth, and Lucius Enderbe's profitable memory. Some received the news as reproof, others as improved gossip, and a few, the best few, received it as shame. Mrs. Pike closed her curtains for a full day, which Florence declared the nearest thing to repentance she had ever observed in her. Miss Marple did not immediately return to the hall. She went instead with Florence along the meadow path to the blackened schoolhouse. Workmen had already propped the surviving wall and set aside a heap of charred beams. Through the broken east window, no longer blind, one could see clear through to the opposite hedge. The effect was almost indecent in its openness. Florence shivered, though the afternoon was warm. "I can never think of it now without that poor girl. Clara, I mean, and Edith, and Sylvia. It all seems too much for one little place." "Places are never little where vanity, fear and love have all been allowed to ferment together," said Miss Marple. "They can hold worlds of corruption in a drawing-room and infinite tenderness in a scullery." Florence said after a pause, "Do you pity Edith?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and no. Pity is not absolution, dear Florence. She did a dreadful thing, but pity is owing where pain has been starved and twisted until it breaks whatever hand it is in. One can condemn and still pity. In fact, one ought. Otherwise, morality becomes merely a form of tidiness." They stood a little longer. The elder leaves stirred above the ruin with a sound like dry applause. At last Florence said, half whispering, "And Sylvia?" Miss Marple looked through the window frame into the brightness beyond. "She has the unpleasant advantage of beginning at last with truth. Most of us begin with comfort and have to scrape toward truth later if we manage it at all. She may do better than any of them." In this, Miss Marple proved correct. 3 days later, Sylvia came to see her before leaving the hall for a time. She had decided to go to Exeter first, to the records office and the cemetery at St Anne's if there was one, and then perhaps to London, where a friend from nursing days could help her find employment. She spoke quietly, with none of the earlier shock left on the surface, yet her quietness was of a different sort now, not braced but chosen. "Mrs. Gresham asked me to stay," she said. Not as companion. She used another word and could hardly get it out. "Niece?" Sylvia gave the faintest, saddest smile. Yes, it seemed to hurt her physically. Often the truth does when it has been kept too long in the wrong posture. "I could not stay. Not yet. The rooms know too much before I do." Miss Marple nodded. "That is wise. Houses can be tyrannical with inherited atmosphere." Sylvia sat for a moment, turning her gloves in her hands. "Do you think Edith hated me a little because I was part of what killed my mother?" The question was so exquisitely cruel in its innocence that Miss Marple answered at once. "No, I think she hated the arrangement into which you were born. She loved you badly, which is a very different matter, and often much more dangerous. There are people who protect others not by opening doors, but by becoming the door and barring it with their own bodies. It is exhausting work, and usually ends badly." Sylvia's eyes filled, but she smiled again, more steadily. "That sounds exactly like Edith." "Yes, and Mrs. Gresham?" Miss Marple chose her words. "She loved in the manner of those who value possession above surrender. That kind of love can feed and clothe and arrange everything except freedom. It is commoner than people think." When Sylvia had gone, Adrien Gresham arrived, awkward and over-formal, carrying a basket of peaches from the hall walls, as if tribute in fruit might make difficult things more manageable. "My aunt wishes to see you before you leave the village," he said. "Also, if it matters, the solicitors are looking into the marriage record. If it's valid, then much may change." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It will matter very much to some people, and far less than they suppose to others. Property is a loud instrument, but not always the tune." Adrien hesitated, then said with unusual seriousness, "I was odious about Sylvia at first. I keep thinking how neatly I stepped into the family habit, seeing inconvenience before injustice." "That is how habits survive," said Miss Marple, "by feeling natural to the beneficiary. The useful thing is that you noticed in time to dislike it." He accepted the rebuke. "If she ever wishes help, I shall give it, without condition." "See that you do not make even help a form of proprietorship," said Miss Marple. "Young men are surprisingly apt to." He laughed, coloured, and admitted the justice of that too. Celia Gresham received Miss Marple in the blue morning room 2 days after Sylvia's departure. The hydrangeas had begun to brown at the edges. Celia herself looked diminished, as if some internal corsetry had been cut, and she had not yet learned how to sit within the looser shape. "Sylvia has gone to Exeter," she said. "Yes." "She may not return." "No." Celia looked at her with a kind of bleak impatience. "You answer as if pronouncing weather." "One cannot bully weather, Mrs. Gresham, nor consequences." For a while Celia stared at the silver teapot as though it belonged to a civilization she no longer entirely trusted. Then she said, very low, "I brought her back because I thought proximity might soothe what I had done. I see now it only allowed me to supervise it. There is a vulgarity in remorse as well as in triumph, Miss Marple. I never understood that." "Few do. Remorse likes to feel noble." Celia's mouth twisted. "Will you tell me one thing honestly? Did Philip love Clara?" Miss Marple looked at the older woman, and because pity was due here too, though of a different order, she answered with the same exact mercy she had given Sylvia. "Enough to marry her. Not enough to have prepared the world for it. Men often mistake feeling for courage. Women pay." Celia shut her eyes. It was perhaps the hardest sentence she had ever been made to hear, because it condemned Philip without removing from her the responsibility of what followed. When Miss Marple left, the windows of the hall stood open to the late August light. Not theatrically, not symbolically arranged, simply open, as windows ought to be when air is needed. Yet she could not help noticing it. A week later, the village fete went on, much reduced, without speeches about restoration. The brass band played uncertainly. Children raced hoops. Tea was served on the vicarage lawn. People were a little subdued, which in villages often passes for virtue, but is sometimes only digestion. Mrs. Pike spoke less than usual. Miss Weatherby was almost tender. Florence Dane, handing cups, declared repeatedly that truth was exhausting, and one should therefore take a second scone. Life, with its shameless instinct for resumption, had begun again. Miss Marple sat beneath the striped awning, where, on that first morning, the scream had interrupted roses and sponge cake. She watched the lane, the moving dresses, the curate dropping jam, the children darting like swallows, and felt, not satisfaction, one is never satisfied by murder, but that thinner, sterner thing that comes when a false arrangement has finally been denied the protection of silence. Florence settled beside her and said, as if continuing a conversation only paused an hour, not a week, "Do you suppose we shall ever quite forget it?" Miss Marple looked across at the old schoolhouse, visible through the trees, one broken window now boarded, but the others clear in the light. "No," she said, "but perhaps we shall remember it differently. That is the most one can hope from communities. Not innocence restored, that is nonsense, but memory made a little less cowardly." A breeze stirred the awning. From the church came the half-hour bell. In the square beyond, windows stood open to the sun. The end.